Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Gönül Tol. I am the director of the Middle East Institute's Turkish Studies and a senior fellow at the Frontier Europe Initiative. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. We will be discussing Turkey's relations with Israel. And we will hear from two outstanding panelists who will discuss evolving state of the state of relations between the two countries and the most recent positive signs that we've been seeing from both parties to see whether there are enough incentives to normalize relations. First, we have Nimrod Goren, who is the founder and head of MITVIM, which is the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and he's also a teaching fellow in Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And next we have Solih Özel. He is a senior lecturer at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical problems, please email events@mei.edu. And also feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I will be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. And with that, we will begin. Well, let me thank you first. Thank you, Solih Özel and Nimrod. Thanks for joining today's discussion.
Thank you.
Relations between the two countries have been tense since the 2010 raid by the Israeli Navy on activists aboard the Mavi Marmara ship, which was part of a flotilla seeking to deliver humanitarian aid in defiance of a blockade of the Gaza Strip. And since then, the debates that tackle with Turkish-Israeli relations raise the same question, which is whether bilateral ties can go back to the golden years of the 1990s. But of course, those who study the history of relations closely know that the strategic alliance the two countries enjoyed in the 1990s was very much an exception in an otherwise troubled relationship. Yes, Turkey was the first country, Muslim majority country, to recognize the state of Israel, but bilateral relations were always problematic due to the strong pro-Palestinian sentiment in Turkish society. And the Palestinian resistance not only had an appeal among the country's Islamic circles, but also among secular Turks, Kurds, and leftist groups. And some of you might remember Turkey downgraded its representation at the Tel Aviv embassy in the 1980s in response to the 1980 Jerusalem law, for instance. And Turkish military had to step in and could be able to restore those ties in the 1990s, but only after the peace negotiations between the PLO and Israel started with Madrid Peace Treaty, because the military was concerned about domestic reaction. So maybe, given that background, a more realistic question for us to be asking today could be whether Turkey and Israel can resume cooperation on matters of joint interest. So let's start with that. And Nimrod, I wanna go to you first. So what are some of those joint interests?
Thank you, Gönül, and it's a pleasure being here at this webinar of MEI together with Solih. I see importance in Turkish-Israeli ties, and we at MITVIM Institute are investing efforts to try and improve them whenever possible. But I think your analysis is very correct in the fact that things or realities that were in place in the 1990s are not in place today. And the expectations from relations that we can have these days is different than what was in the mid-90s. We are not talking about these honeymoon years in which there was not only security cooperation, but also very vast civil cooperation, exchange, warm attitudes from one side towards the other, economic exchange. Things are much more limited these years, and the expectation should be different. I think the goal now will be to restore full diplomatic ties between Israel and Turkey. Israel-Turkey relations are resilient. They were never cut off from 1949, despite the ups and downs, but currently, for the last 2 years, there are no ambassadors in place, and this should be fixed. Ambassadors in place will be able to restore political dialogue, strategic dialogue, enable the two countries to exchange views on regional affairs, even if they are not agreeing on them, to better understand the needs and concerns of each other. I think this is a realistic goal. It was done in 2016 when both Netanyahu and Erdogan were signing the reconciliation agreement solving the Mavi Marmara crisis, although that agreement did not last for too long. And there are some joint interests that the countries can come together around, things about regional stability, issues happening in Syria, a joint interest perhaps in containing and limiting the role of Iran in the region, improving both countries' positioning in the Middle East, in which both of them are facing difficulties. Both countries care about humanitarian situation in Gaza, living conditions there, each one from a different angle. So there are issues of joint interest, including the mutual trade, tourism, whenever that becomes possible again, and also in decreasing tensions and conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is becoming a big issue, which we may talk about later in this discussion.
Sure, thanks, Nimrod. Solly, defense partnership has been the backbone of bilateral ties for decades. So what is the state of defense cooperation between the two countries since Mavi Marmara? And that would give us a sense of whether normalization or cooperation is possible despite everything that we've been hearing from both leaders.
I mean, not only since Mavi Marmara, but also since Operation Cast-led, the relations between the two militaries have actually weakened. It is also not a surprise that the weakening of the military-to-military relations also coincided with a period in Turkey where there were court cases against retired officers and then serving officers, and even a chief of staff of the Turkish armed forces had to serve time in jail for being the leader of a terrorist organization. Anyway, those were our peculiarities perhaps, but there are no more joint operations to the best of my knowledge. Whether or not the two militaries still share intelligence, as I think the civilian sides do, at least occasionally do, and when he was prime minister, Tayyip Erdogan actually acknowledged as much when he was once confronted with such a question. But obviously, what drives the relations today is not military to military relations. This also reflects, of course, not just the shift in the power structure within Turkey or the shift of power from the military to the elected government in Turkey, but it also reflects Turkey's much better conditions strategically or geopolitically in the aftermath of the Iraq War. I mean, Turkey did not want the Iraq War, but then the United States bungled the Iraq War. And in a way, it allowed Turkey to actually open up to the Middle East and conduct much more ambitious and much more outward-looking relations with almost all its neighbors. And that's why this was, if you will, the golden age of the principle of zero problems with neighbors. And that was broken. In turn, that spell was broken with the Arab revolts and the choices that the Turkish government has made, not just in Syria, but also in other countries that put it at odds with many of its allies and many of the countries within the region as well. But those are all really civilian choices. Finally, maybe there is a comeback of the military in terms of defining Turkish foreign and security policies, I mean, after all, Turkey has been engaged in 4 different military operations and does have a very prominent military presence in Syria itself. It has been an active actor in Libya, and in fact, Turkish involvement, military involvement, turned the tide in Libya. And therefore, I think the period of keeping the military away from decision-making on security and foreign policy matters, to the extent that it happened, is actually not continuing in the same intensity, and they're also coming back.
And also, as a follow-up question, you talk about the geostrategic factors and domestic political factors when you were referring to the weakening meal-to-meal relations between the two countries. What about the implications of the coup attempt on the structure of the military, on the professionalization of military? Because what you hear from US defense analysts and some at the Pentagon, that the Turkish military is not the same. It's less professional, it's more ideological, difficult to work with, doesn't have the same culture. So do you think it played a role in Turkish military's relationship with Israeli military?
I mean, again, I will try to walk on a firm base, because I don't follow the developments within the military much. There is nothing surprising about the Turkish military having changed. First of all, when the so-called Eurasianists were being ousted or tried within the were being eliminated from the Turkish military, and in retrospect, we know that this was the doing of the Gülenists. The United States basically just watched, and the assumption was that the Atlanticists were replacing them or displacing them. Therefore, there is a large body of officers, I suppose, who are very resentful against the United States. Second, and I'm sure the Turkish military, as much as any other part of Turkish society, is incensed and probably suspicious that the United States has some elements within the US government had something to do with the coup. Whether that is true or not, I'm not going to get into that debate, but that obviously is a very prominent, it's a prevalent, not just sentiment, but belief among the most pro-American, or certainly not very anti-American circles within Turkey. And I'm sure that the Turkish military has that as well. As to their professionalism, again, I really cannot speak to that, but as I said, the Turkish military has been engaged in 4 different military operations in Syria since August 2016. I haven't really read anything that suggests that there's been a major failure in what they have done. Maybe these were not extraordinarily important operations. It is true that when they did intervene, they needed Russian approval, especially in the last one. They did not really achieve all their targets. Both the United States and the Russians managed to actually contain the ambitions of the Turkish military or Turkish security operators. But they're also doing fine, if for nothing else, because of the drones in Libya. So whether it is less or more professional, I don't know. Finally, don't forget that the American military, in terms of how it dealt with the Turkish military after the Iraqi invasion, was not particularly professional either. They were also very sentimental because of the March 1 decree that was rejected by the Turkish parliament, that would have allowed the deployment of American troops. So between CENTCOM and the Turkish military, there's always been bad blood. And now that CENTCOM perhaps is getting out of the way somehow, and in Libya, Turkey maybe deals with either Eurocom or Africacom, maybe those relations are going to get better as well. But whether this suggests Turkish military is doing all those things in spite of the fact that it is less professional than before, I really cannot answer.
Well, Nimrod, what do you think? Do you share Soli's assessment that there is the military-to-military partnership is weakening, and maybe from an Israeli perspective, Turkey is is less valuable because Israeli defense industries have found larger markets than Turkey for their exports, including India, Japan, and South Korea. So does that, first, let me ask, do you agree that military-to-military partnership is weakening? And my second question is, if the Israeli defense industry have found alternatives, will that make resumption of ties more difficult?
First, the military relations were the key determinant in Israel-Turkey relations for decades. Going back to the 50s, it was military cooperation. Two countries were signing the Alliance of the Periphery agreements behind the scenes, the generals and leaders speaking with each other on strategic affairs, while all other issues of civilian, economic, diplomatic relations were overshadowed by the military. In the 1990s, again, the military agreement, the strategic cooperation was on top of the agenda. Then it was broadened a bit. I don't think that nature of relations is the type that we want to see necessarily between Israel and Turkey, relations that are based on military. Definitely joint security and strategic interests can help the countries be closer together, but we need to expand other fields of cooperation as well. What happened after the Mavi Mamre and in the decade that followed created a loss of trust from the Israeli side in the Turkish side. So it's not only whether the political relations enable security cooperation, it's whether at all Israelis now trust Turkey as a strategic partner. Will information that Israel conveys to Turkey regarding regional issues reach Iran or not? This is the concern in Israel, and therefore the systems do not trust Turkey as a reliable partner, and therefore that's one of the reasons why cooperation, I think, is limited, plus perhaps also a Turkish reluctance from cooperation with Israel. Having said that, we need to take into account that there are channels of communication, and we read occasionally in the media about meetings, exchanges between top security intelligence officials that are keeping in touch, and that is an important component. And another point on that is we have to look at the new Israeli government. Our foreign minister, our minister of defense are both ex-chief of staff of the Israeli army. Chief of staff of the Israeli army usually acknowledge the strategic importance of Turkey. They come from an Israeli elite that many in Turkey feel comfortable with. They are more moderate actors than ones within Likud. I think Gantz and Ashkenazi could be better interlocutors for dialogue with Turkey because of their military background than other leaders within the current government. So
there have been, and this is a question to both of you, there have been positive signs recently which led many to believe that efforts are underway to ease the tension. Both sides acknowledge the difficulties, but positive signs, for instance, Turkey allowed the export of medical aid to Israel after the corona outbreak. An Israeli cargo plane landed in Turkey recently, and that hadn't happened for a decade. The Israeli embassy in Ankara posted a tweet praising its relations with Turkey. And unnamed Israeli officials told the news outlet that shared interests such as in Syria and gas supplies in East Med should bring the countries together. So what do you think? Are there efforts to normalize diplomatic relations? How serious? Because I'm hearing different things. I mean, from the Israeli side, I'm hearing that the problems are so huge that no such efforts are underway, and the Turkish side is saying that Eastern Med especially is important. So what is your sense?
I yield to Nimrod first, then I'll have something to say.
Thank you, dear Soli. First, positive signs and news on Israel-Turkey relations are important because we don't hear them quite often in recent years. If you follow the media in Israel and Turkey, bilateral relations are often covered and portrayed in a negative light, exchange of criticism from both leaders, etc. So having such signs in the news is good. I will not overplay their importance. I do not think that the current conditions enable a breakthrough in the relation. It's important that these diplomatic, commercial, economic ties are happening. We must remember that also throughout the Mavi Mamre crisis, there was continuous negotiations on the resolution, also almost from 2010 to 2016. when the agreement was signed. So efforts are underway. There are diplomats on the ground. You know, the Israeli Chargé d'Affaires in Ankara published an article in a Turkish outlet. So these things are happening, and it's good that they are happening. But the conditions are not one that are conducive to that. You know, we're today on July 1st. This is the date after which Israel and Netanyahu want to move ahead with annexation plans. You hear the responses from Turkey to a possibility of an Israeli annexation. Given the intensity of the debate in Turkey about the Palestinian issue, I don't think that any move that Israel does on annexation will help reconciliation or better relation with Turkey. On the other hand, in Israel, you know, people don't have the motivation to move forward with Turkey. They don't think of Turkey anymore as a potential partner. People gave up on Turkey in a way. They think that the downgrading of ties in 2018, it was a Turkish move and that the ball is in Turkish hands, and Turkey should do the next move, and until it doesn't, nothing will change. So I think there is a limitation, but we also have to remember relations between the two countries are not only Netanyahu and Erdogan and the governments. There are civil society actors, business actors, think tanks that are working to increase channels of communication and are doing that continuously. Some of them do not share the convictions and policies of their governments and are cooperating on issues of social change and conflict resolution and regional analysis. So that's an important layer of civil society cooperation that also brings some positive news into the debate.
Oli?
Look, this has always been, maybe except for the 1990s, a shy relation. That is, the Turkish side did not really want to make it public.
Yep.
Remember, I mean, after all, the first visit by David Ben-Gurion in Turkey was a secret visit. We had to learn it from Israeli scholars that such a visit took place. The Oslo Accords, in my judgment, rather than the Madrid talks, really gave the legitimacy to finally display the passionate love affair that actually existed between the two countries and make it public. We're not going to go back to that period. Both the Turks and the Turkish society and Israeli society have a rather strong self-righteous streak. The Israelis may feel betrayed because Turkey did this, that, and the other. Mavi Marmara is Turkey's responsibility, and the Turks obviously feel that the Israelis have not played it right, did not keep their promises to the Palestinians or whatever. That may not be easily repaired, and the Israelis also, I don't think, see the results of what they do. That is what may be considered an imperative for security reasons in Israel when they attack Gaza is basically causing an outrage, and not just in Turkey, but also in possibly much of the rest of the world as well. So the perspectives are very different, and therefore let's put that aside. Let's assume that tourists are not going to come back very easily, but tens of flights every week before the coronavirus hit between Tel Aviv and Istanbul, so much so that El Al wanted a piece of the action. It didn't want to leave the entire market to THY, Pegasus, and whoever else flies. Secondly, despite Mavi Marmara, as Nimrod said, trade relations have actually improved. There used to be much more Israeli investment. There isn't now, but that may be reflective of the general investment climate in Turkey more than just the animosity between the two countries. The way I see these things is, despite the fact that the two leaders, Netanyahu and Erdogan, don't particularly like one another, despite the fact that the trust is broken, despite the fact that it would be very difficult to repair relations and put them back on track, the two countries recognize that structurally they need one another. This is a relation that is an important one for the general stability of the Middle East, which will become even more unstable in the near future, in my judgment, particularly if the Israelis go ahead with the annexation of the remainder of the West Bank. It is important to maintain that relation. Now, it is true that after relations have deteriorated so far, Israel actually began to have much better and much closer relations, which probably will not be broken anytime soon, with two countries with which it really did not have historically good relations. One is the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek part of the island of Cyprus, and the other one, of course, is the Greek government. And in spite of the fact that Israel and Turkey had their tit-tats, and then Israel participated in those energy summits that Turkey was not even invited to and all that, Israel did not sign the agreement that Egypt, Cyprus, and Greece have signed together. To the best of my understanding, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who does not have any love lost for President Erdogan, did not really to take the bait that Prime Minister Mitsotakis pushed when he said, you know, Turkey is going to be even a bigger headache, a bigger threat than Iran for Israel and all that. Therefore, still rationality prevails, and in the confines of the tensions, the two countries continue to cooperate in matters that actually in matters that actually matter. And in a way, this is once more a shy relation, a much less public relation. Can it move forward? It will, even if it does move forward, I don't think it will do so rapidly, but the structural imperative still remains there as I see it.
So that structural imperative, you make the argument that these two countries recognize that they need each other. But my question is, obviously, to move things forward, you need a political will on both sides. Yet domestic policies, I mean, the developments on the domestic front, don't they play an important role preventing normalization? I mean, given the rightward shift in Israeli politics and what Turkey has, what Erdogan has turned Turkey into. So, how much of an obstacle is the latest the domestic developments play?
But that's fine. I mean, you said it yourself, right? At the beginning, the Turkish governments, successive Turkish governments, could not have an open, intimate relation with the state of Israel because of the pro-Palestinian sentiment in the country. That was the break. But nonetheless, the relations existed, and Turkey never really responded to the calls and the temptations to actually break diplomatic relations with Israel. Today, too, public opinion is a factor. But what I see nowadays, and I don't know what will happen if the annexation begins, the government doesn't fan the fires of anti-Israelism within the country so far. And we have a lot of other preoccupations, quite frankly. Therefore, yes, there are constraints, and the public opinion is one such constraint. But that public opinion is also, in the past decade or so, has been shaped by the government. And if the government chooses not to push it too far, it doesn't in and of itself generate a massive explosion of anti-Israeli sentiment either.
But my argument is that even in the 1990s, that's why I referred to Madrid conference, even the military, to be able to restore ties, they have to take into consideration the state of...
No argument. No, I'm not saying the public opinion doesn't count. All I'm saying is it's a constraint. It's not an impediment.
Okay, I want to turn to audience questions. One question that I keep receiving is, what is, if there are conditions, Nimrod, this is probably for you. I mean, what would be the condition, the number one condition for Israel to normalize ties with Turkey? Is it Turkey's support for Hamas? What is on top of the Israeli agenda?
I think the conditions at the moment are Turkish conditions, because Netanyahu government signed an agreement with Turkey in 2016. It met some of the Turkish conditions that were presented to resolve the Mavi Marmara crisis. Then the downturn in the reconciliation process came as a Turkish response, first to the American decision to relocate the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and as a response to violence that erupted after protests on the Gaza border. So it was a Turkish move, and I think the expectation in Israel is for Turkey to change course. My assumption is, although there is not a lot of enthusiasm within the Israeli governmental and political system towards ties with Turkey at the moment. Should there be an interest coming from Turkey, Israel will be on board. The Israeli policies in the East Med and the Eastern Mediterranean has been mentioned, is along the last years one that Israel wants to portray as a win-win foreign policy. Israel used to have a zero-sum diplomacy in the region, but it tried to maintain its relation with Turkey. At the same time, we're developing very close alliances with Greece, with Cyprus, and with Egypt. So I think Israel would try to maintain this, although as time goes by, it becomes more difficult to do so. Now, you mentioned domestic politics, the interlinkage between domestic politics and foreign policy. I think it's very clear in both of our societies. As elections draw near, you usually would see more negative rhetoric, more aggressive rhetoric from each leader towards the other. But as Soli mentioned, there is a limit to that. The two leaders even erased tweets that were going too far, perhaps, in the past. That, in a way, shapes public opinion to the negative, and that's something we have to remember. When the public hears so much negative rhetoric and aggressive statements from each side towards the other, eventually it sticks, and it jeopardizes the general positive attitude that Israelis have towards Turkey because of the personal experiences while touring Turkey in the past.
So you mentioned, Imrod, and there's a question about that. You mentioned Eastern Mediterranean. There could be a win-win situation. What would a win-win scenario look like in Eastern Med for both countries?
No, so the East Med is becoming an important factor in Israel's foreign policy over the last decade because it began because of natural gas findings, an expectation for big financial gains, but eventually it was broadened to many other topics, and it led to stronger bilateral ties that Israel has with some countries in the region, to some trilateral alliances, and to regional mechanisms. Soli mentioned the East Med Gas Forum that Turkey is not part of. So that has been consolidated. I think that Israel's interest is to see regional cooperation in the Mediterranean become more inclusive. So for Israel to have Turkey and Lebanon as part of the East Med Gas Forum will be a positive development. For Israel to see Turkey and Egypt find a way to live together will be important, okay? Now, it's not easy because of all the conflict there, but the Israeli experience, for example, with Qatar, shows that it's possible when there's a clear joint interest. Qatar is in a very different place than other Israeli alliances in the East Med, especially Egypt. But when Qatar brings money and cash into the Gaza Strip, and that serves the interest of both Egypt and Israel, the countries are cooperating with each other, although they have deep ideological differences. I think that's one of the contexts. And the second thing is the impact of the coronavirus crisis on the prospects of gas profits. All these ideas of an East Med pipeline that were difficult and not feasible from the onset seem far-fetched when you look at what happens to the energy market and gas prices. So if gas is a bit less on the agenda of regional cooperation in the East Med, it may open up cooperation in other fields that are a bit less politically divisive, and perhaps there will be more room for more inclusive cooperation in the East Med, which includes Turkey together with Israel. If Israel and the Palestinian Authority can be together in the East Med Gas Forum, then I think Israel and Turkey can be there as well.
And of course, Soli, please let me know what you think about this. I think, obviously, Turkey's priority in East Med, it's from a domestic point of view, Erdogan cannot score in Syria anymore. Before, I've always argued that foreign policy served Erdogan in terms of consolidating his power at home, and Turkey launched several military interventions there. He mobilized his base, but there came a point where Turkey was cornered in Syria and didn't much have room to maneuver. So then turned to Libya. And what's important in Libya is Turkish domestic public opinion doesn't care much, doesn't really know what's going on in Libya. But of course, Libya is very much linked to East Mediterranean, which resonates very well within Turkish public. So I believe what Turkey is doing in Libya is closely linked to Eastern Med. So whenever we talk about what Turkey and Israel can do there, you also have to include Libya in the conversation. So on that, they support different. What does Israel think about Libya, given Turkish military involvement there, given Turkey's support for the Sarraj government?
As for Nimrod, I suppose. I don't know what the Israelis think.
I think Libya is seen a bit as a faraway issue for Israel, and Israel will try to keep out of what is happening. You saw that Israel was not part of this statement declaration between the 5 states, including UAE and France, against Turkey. So Israel doesn't want to enter that field. And I think in principle, Israel doesn't want to take sides too much beyond what it thinks it has to in tensions on the East Med. In general, the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Mediterranean basis as a whole, was emerging as a sub-region with positive prospects for cooperation, different than the dynamics of the Middle East. The Middle East was engaged in instability, in civil wars after the Arab Spring. The Mediterranean was becoming a very hopeful place for Israel. It combines European and Middle Eastern identity. It enables Israel to be part of regional mechanism. It's a bit softer on political issues. And all of these tensions that are now heightening go against, I think, Israeli interest there. And therefore, I think Israel would want on one hand to keep out, on the other hand to find ways to moderate the tensions. And therefore, when you hear reports about Palestinians' agreement with Turkey on a maritime border, I think that's not really feasible, because the Palestinian Authority has its good ties with Egypt and Jordan, and not with the access of Turkey. Israel will also want to see perhaps some resolution to its maritime border conflict with Lebanon. Now, this is something the American mediated on, not successfully until now, but that's the approach, reach the agreements, ease the tensions, enable the Mediterranean to be a sphere, a space for cooperation, and then take the profits that you can, whether it's economic or in other fields.
There is another question asking about the developing relationship between Israel and the UAE, and the question is, doesn't that make Turkey less important for Israel?
If it did make Turkey less important, then Turkey and Israeli relations would have been worse off for it. I really don't think so. Turkey's place is a different one. Look, at the end of the day, how can we be sure that UAE and Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, are going to be stable places 5 years from now? I don't know. I mean, I don't anticipate that they will fall apart, but I don't really see much of a guarantee that they're going to be very strong, very powerful either, especially if the Israelis go ahead with the annexation. I mean, Turkey, whether we like it or not, is geographically a pretty important place, and I think the Israelis recognize this. It also has a presence economically, despite this crisis, politically and all that. In fact, to add to what Nimrod has said, Eastern Mediterranean with the energy resources really could have been a place where cooperation actually trumped conflict. It is not happening, partially because there are really no mediators. The Americans are not really in this, but also the Russians probably would not want the energy sources, which are, by the way, I mean, everybody makes a big fuss about Eastern Mediterranean energy sources. That's 3% of the world gas supply. It's nothing. It really is nothing. Secondly, this Med pipeline probably is not going to materialize, and the Turkish route still remains the best one. I sat down at a table with a responsible person from the Republic of Cyprus who argued that they would never really help that pipeline go from Israel through Cyprus to Turkey because of enmity to Turkey. These are not really rational behaviors as far as I'm concerned. We will have to wait a lot for that gas to actually make it to European markets, if the European markets are still there, by the way. I mean, I'm not quite sure that 10 years from now, those investments are going to pay. Therefore, for Israel, as I said, structurally, Turkey is an important country, despite the ideological differences. And for Turkey, even with the current ideological dispensation of Turkey, the link to Israel is pretty important. Remember, at the end of the day, those are really one of the 2 or 3 countries in the region that can still be called states. I mean, despite all the turbulence, they do behave like states, and that really makes a difference. Finally, maybe the audience doesn't know this. Turkey has substantially reduced its imports of gas from Russia. And Azerbaijan is now our first supplier. But do you know who we get our gas from these days? We get LPG from Egypt and the United States. And from the looks of it, Turkey and Egypt are fine, but I mean, we're getting gas from Egypt, just like we're having nice trade relations with Israel, but at the face of it, we are mortal enemies. So there are lots of things that are happening beyond, I mean, below the surface that one needs to pay attention to. And so long as cool heads prevail, and I hope that in Libya, Turkey and Egypt do not come head to head, then we will have to find a way of actually turning this region not to an area of cooperation rather than conflict, because conflict is not going to be beneficial for anyone.
And Nimrod, I think this is a question to Deborah Jones asked, how will grow, similar question from an Israeli point of view, how will growing ties between Israel and the Gulf countries, particularly those who are openly hostile to Turkey, affect normalization between Israel and Turkey?
From an Israeli point of view, these relations serve very different interests. The relation with the UAE especially is a gateway for Israel-Arab relations. Okay, and that's an important goal in Israel's foreign policy, to increase its acceptance and its belonging within the Arab Middle East. In a country like UAE, with which you have really positive signs happening over the last few years. You know, in October, unless the coronavirus crisis, we were supposed to go as Israelis to the Expo exhibition in Dubai, and perhaps even have a temporary embassy at the UAE for the length of the exhibition. So a lot of things are happening with the UAE. I don't see them related to relation with Turkey. When the UAE enters the East Med, then that may bring it into the calculations that Israel has in that region. But these things are separate. You know, and the Gulf is not only the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I mentioned it's also Qatar and Israel.
Wait.
Well, Israel has relation with Qatar, although Qatar is closely affiliated with Muslim Brotherhood. There have been questions in the chat about that with Hamas. So that's not a precondition for Israel to cooperate with the country, to have it within this, what is called the moderate Sunni states, how Israelis tend to call this alliance of Egypt and Jordan and Saudis and the UAE. Now, if Israel wants to do outreach to different actors within the Palestinian society, then having countries that can communicate with Hamas can be a plus. No, Qatar plays a role that helps Israeli interests. Turkey also had motivations to improve conditions in Gaza. It didn't really play out on them, and when, you know, after the reconciliation agreement, when Turkey could invest in big infrastructure projects in Gaza, it didn't do that a lot, but it has, I think, the possibility, and if it wants to, I don't think Israel would want to block that. So, bottom line, relation with the Gulf serve Israel either in the Palestinian issue and containing that, or in developing Israel-Arab ties. And I think these are very different interests than what Israel has when it wants to improve relations with Turkey.
And Soli, this question is for you. How has Israel been portrayed in Turkish media, whether there's any change there compared to the last decade?
Very positively, of course. The thing is, I mean, I don't follow Akit. Probably we don't really hear all that much. I mean, first of all, there hasn't been much of a big war or a big conflict with Hamas in Gaza in a couple of years at least. Therefore, when there is not much bad news coming from Israel-Palestine, there is really not all that much interest in what goes on or to present Israel in a bad light either. There was some interest in following the Israeli elections, and I suppose a lot of people in Turkey wanted Bibi to lose, and he did not. And I'm sure the president also wished him ill and did not want him to become prime minister again. But so, for the moment, in fact, I am quite surprised that with the anticipation of annexation really beginning in the West Bank, there wasn't much negative, or there wasn't a more furious negative coverage of those news so far. And those, of course, coincided with the positive developments that you have mentioned. If the Israelis do initiate moves to annex parts of the West Bank, I'm sure there's going to be a very negative reaction, but whether or not the government will also take the lead in that, That I really do not know, or at what level they will keep the tone of their criticism.
And there is a question about the growing Turkish-Russian defense partnership and Turkish-Russian cooperation in Syria, and whether that could have any impact on Turkish-Israeli relations.
Look, I thought that President Erdogan was the one who saw Vladimir Putin more frequently than any other leader, but I understand that Bibi Netanyahu saw Putin more often than even Tayyip Erdogan last year. So the two sides have good relations with Russia, and whether or not when they exchange intelligence on Syria, or if their common interests in Syria also mean that they also talk about these matters separately with the Russians as well. I am always perplexed by how Americans, maybe the rest of the world, look at Turkey-Russia relations unidimensionally. The same Turkey that is supposed to be having growing military ties with Russia has just refueled an American plane over the Black Sea. That was a no-go area for Turkey, for the United States, as far as Turkey was concerned, since the end of the Cold War. Therefore, and Turkey, that is not supposed to be any longer an ally in NATO, has been more active in NATO and in more and has been taking part in more operations, exercises of NATO than ever before, and nobody seems to actually notice these things. There are ironies in the way Turkey conducts its policy. It flirts with Russia, it flirts with the United States. It is a member of NATO, it benefits from it, and then it infuriates the NATO members. But obviously, France infuriates other NATO members as well. Only 8 countries sided with the French when the French wanted to criticize Turkey over what happened to their ship and the Turkish frigate on the 10th of June last month. Therefore, I think one has to have more radars on alert, trying to figure out exactly what Turkey is doing. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's all consistent, but to say that Turkey is now becoming a major military ally of Russia, I think is just too facile a way of looking at things, at those relations. And we still do not know, by the way, the fate of the S-400s. Remember, they were supposed to have been operational on April 15.
Well, Soli, you answered this question partly. A question asking what effect would a possible Turkish departure from NATO? I don't think anyone on this panel believes that's going to happen anytime soon. But maybe I could change the question a bit and ask you whether Turkish, this Turkish, Israel, US, there's been a triangular relationship. So do you think any positive developments on Turkish-US relations would have an impact on Turkey-Israel ties?
If anything, probably the reverse would be more true. If there was an improvement in Turkish-Israeli diplomatic and political relations, that may have a repercussion in the United States. I mean, like everyone else, I'm waiting for the 3rd of November to see which one's going to be the next American administration. Will we go back to at least the familiar ways where we can at least understand the signals, or will we go to the Trump way, where everybody feels a bit strange, trying to first understand what the logic is and then where the region is going? It is going to be a continuation with the Trump administration, which, by the way, I think the Turkish government prefers, because they are much more comfortable with Trump than they would be with Biden. But the pro-Israeli disposition of the Trump administration may generate problems, or, as I said, if the government in Turkey chooses not to make a big fuss about those things, they will just go by the wayside. And then Turkish-Israeli relations under the radar are going to continue as they are now.
And this is a question for both of you. For Ankara and for Tel Aviv, is there a go-to person or institution in the US government on Israel-Turkey relations? That's a question from Jim Holman.
I'm not sure about it. You know, we saw the American intervention during the Obama administration helping to bring Israel and Turkey closer together after the Mavi Marmara crisis. Remember that when President Obama was visiting Israel, that was the time when the phone conversation between Netanyahu and Erdogan, in which Netanyahu apologized for the Mavi Marmara incident, that's when it took place under the auspice of President Obama. So the lack of American intervention in mediation between Israel and Turkey is something that I think Israel is missing, and we don't have that now. Given that and taking into account the previous question, Israel's interest is to see Turkey continue to be part of the West. You know, those in Israel that call to expel Turkey from NATO as a reaction to Turkey's negative attitude toward the Israeli government policies, that's a mistake from Israel's national interest. We need to see Turkey as part of the family of nations that we are part of, rather than move and drift away to other places. There is also a misperception about Turkish foreign policy, and that goes both ways. You know, you mentioned assumptions about Turkey becoming an ally of Russia. In Israel, there's many people thinking of Turkey as an ally of Iran. You know, you go to Ankara, you go to Istanbul, people laugh when you tell them so, but that is something people believe in Israel. The same way people in Turkey believe that Israel is invested a lot in helping the Kurds in northern Syria, which is definitely not a priority for Israel's national security apparatus. So these misperceptions about alliances and foreign policy tendencies are the ones that necessitate the mutual bilateral strategic dialogue that can bring this issue into a common place to debate. And if the US and the Americans and NATO is there on the table, that will definitely be beneficial.
Solly?
I mean, first of all, I really like this. Is Turkey turning its back to the West? What is the West today? Is the United States turning its back to the West? Is it true what we read in the American papers that the President of the United States, the designated leader of the West, is thinking of leaving the NATO alliance, or he's at least expressed that wish several times to his aides in different conversations? I mean, one cannot, on the one hand, speak of the crisis in Western or transatlantic relations and then discuss Turkish foreign policy in the context of whether or not Turkey is turning its back to the West. What is the West today? What's the common ground? What are the common interests? How are we going to be cooperating after we determine what the common interests of that particular West is? What will be the distribution of responsibilities? How much more will the United States continue to invest in Europe? What will be the relation between Europe and the United States? What will be the European contribution to its own security? And what will be the role of Turkey in that security? Those are all things that are up in the air, and there is not even a consensus among the Europeans as to what it is that they think they ought to be doing for their own protection. Therefore, I find all these endless discussions about is Turkey turning its back to the West, leaving the West and whatever, totally nonsensical. Totally nonsensical. Yes, Turkey does have a government who's ideologically been developed as an anti-Western thing, but institutionally it is very comfortable being within NATO. Maybe it takes advantage of being a member of NATO in order to actually pursue other relations. But France's Macron is as interested in having good relations with Russia as the Turkish government. Does that make France a non-Western country? There are different ways of dealing with Russia. Everybody is doing that. Israel has extremely close relations with the Russians. Does that make Israel an anti-Western country? I mean, we have to recognize, or at least we cannot have this separate discussion about what the construction of the new world order is going to be, where lots of ideas are actually flying around and we don't know actually where to start holding the ends, and then discuss a case like Turkey as if nothing has changed since 1988. I find this unreasonable, quite frankly. Yes, Turkey does do things that some of its Western partners do not like, and some of Turkey's Western partners do a lot of things that Turkey doesn't like. A European Union member, Hungary, is as authoritarian as Turkey is. So where do we put all those things? It's a very confusing period, and we have to look at what actors are doing. And when I look at what Turkey is doing, I really don't see it leaving NATO at all.
One last question before we wrap up. The question says, Erdogan done anything for the Palestinians except for the narrative? Is Turkey, what is it that Turkey is doing in places like Gaza or the West Bank? What are some of the concrete things that Turkey is doing?
To the best of my knowledge, I mean, obviously, the rhetoric of being the protector of the Palestinians and what happens on the ground are not the same. And to the extent that Turkey, hospital, aid, Red Crescent, maybe some construction, but I suppose these things, even those efforts are now much more constrained than they were before, because you have to have an agreement with the Israelis. A lot of people argued within Turkey that it did not make sense to constantly have quarrels with the Israeli government, because that impedes you from actually being able to do things. It impedes your ability to do things in Gaza. And so in this limited version, Turkey is doing whatever it has agreed that it can do with the Israelis. To the best of my knowledge, that's the situation. I don't know what Nimrod would say.
Nimrod?
I would say that the Turkish involvement on concrete issues regarding the Palestinians is very limited. It's been used partly as regional positioning of Erdogan, and you'll see it after an annexation step is happening, how Erdogan will try to differentiate his response and the one of Arab leaders who may be more moderate in their response. This happened in the past, and Turkey will want to show that it cares more about the Palestinians than other Arab leaders. Turkey, I think, lost some of its leverage to influence on the Palestinian arena because of its crisis with Israel. The fact that Turkey does not have a consul general in East Jerusalem or an ambassador in Tel Aviv makes an impact, I think, on the Palestinian issue. And eventually, when Israel turns to try and promote peace with its Palestinian neighbors, then a country like Turkey would find a way to contribute. We remember previous years, we remember President Peres, President Abbas, jointly speaking to the Turkish parliament, conveying messages of peace. Turkey was hosting all kind of regional mediation effort. So that could happen in the future, but currently the direction is a totally different one, and therefore it seems less relevant. The only place where you do see some Turkish involvement, and this is contested within Israel, to what extent it's happening, is Jerusalem, when there is some soft power actions taken by Turkey on culture, education, heritage, tourism. That is happening on the ground. Some see it as positive, some see it as negative, but it's definitely there.
Well, we have to end the discussion there. Soli has another commitment, but this has been a great discussion. So thank you, Soli and Nimrod. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope our viewers did too. Thank you again, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you, and than's for everyone who's been with us. Bye.
Thank you.